Good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. Good morning. Too loud? Oh, that's too loud.
This is John and Jan.
It gets used during the week by other groups, so I can't just leave it in one setting. Can you hear me in the back okay? Great. Great to have you. Great to see you. Look, the only chairs in the back are the only ones open, so it's thrilling. I've met some of you here, I think, for the first time this morning, and others I haven't gotten to meet yet. So my name's Paul. Very glad to have you here. We're in the middle of a series called The Year of the Bible, and it's not just kind of a Bible study, but we're looking at the big picture. We started out talking about how does God reveal himself to us through reason and through revelation, and why does he need to reveal himself through revelation rather than just reason? How did that revelation take place? The part of it that's written is the part we come to call Scripture, which literally means that which is written. And now today we want to talk a little bit about, we did an overview of how the tradition that was God's revelation was transmitted until part of it became the historical reliability of the New Testament documents. And we'll talk more about what that means in a minute. But first, we've only got 2 more of the parish bulletin bloopers. So what I may do, how many have ever seen a book called Anguished English by Richard Lederer? There's a whole chapter in there of parish bulletin bloopers, but he's got other bloopers from his students. I think he taught English in junior high or something. He's got them from court records. He's got them from headlines. Great stuff. So we could still just do some of that just for fun. Or we could do Bible riddles. I have about 100 Bible riddles that we can do. Yeah, from my tradition, you do all that Bible stuff from the time of your kids. It's fun. So, but anyway, the 2 for this morning, I hope I haven't repeated these. Please place your donation in the envelope along with the deceased person you want to remember. And then finally, this is my favorite one. I hope I have not repeated it, but it's worth a repeat if it is. This Sunday being Easter, Wilhelmina Jones will come forward at the end of the worship service to lay an egg on the altar. Okay. I want to thank, as always, Julie Lugar for her wonderful presentation of the breakfast every Sunday morning. And all the dear folks who've been helping her, thank you. She could use some help with that. She surprised me this morning with yet another blessing for the group. I've been thinking for weeks, I need to get the prayer of St. Thomas Aquinas that we all use before study, and to make a holy card or a bookmark or something. She did it. She had it made herself. So I'm going to take one, and please, just one per person. If we run out, we'll have some more made. Thank you, Julie. Thank you. But in the meantime, even as we pass it out, in the interest of time, let's go on ahead and start with a prayer. If you don't have one, raise your hand quick and we can get you one. All right. Just grab some. Hand them out to anybody. He'll give you one if you got your hand up. And then I'll just say in the future that I usually just keep them up here on the table, so you're free to get one. Did everybody get the main handout for today? I should say session 6. I've been saying you can bring your handout back and we'll continue, but I ended up putting more information, expanding it some. So if you only have the one from last week, please make sure you get one that says session 6 up there. Great. Thank you for helping me distribute those. I appreciate it. All right, let's pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord my God, bestow upon me an understanding that knows you, diligence in seeking you, wisdom in finding you, a way of life that is pleasing to you, perseverance that waits trustfully for you, and confidence that I shall embrace you at the last. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you. I'm going to show my age now, which I'm doing all the time anyway, so it doesn't really matter. How many of you remember the game Telephone, where somebody would have, like, say something, whisper it in the ear of another person, they'd whisper it in the ear of the next, and around a big circle, and then at the end, the last person would say aloud what they thought they heard, and the first person would compare it to what they actually said, and it was always very different. Do you remember that? If you're too young to remember the game, we could rename it Cell Phone, and teach you how to play it. It's a lot of fun. And the point of it was supposed to be that, you know, especially with rumors, how something gets started and the original statement may be true, but then it gets changed as it goes around. And I think of that when I occasionally get very sincere questions from folks, sometimes in RCIA or other places. How can I really know that what we say we know about Jesus, we really do know? How can I know it's the truth? How can I know that he wasn't just a myth or a legend, or that people turned the historical man into a legend? How do I know that? And sometimes ask that with a very anguished heart, because it's a great obstacle to their faith, to being able to believe. And so today, part of what I want to talk about is in response to that question. And the first thing I want to say is that we're going to focus on the New Testament documents today. It's a session about the Bible, a series about the Bible, and so there's good reason for that. But I'll come back to this at the end. But to keep in mind that we'll be looking at how secular historians have standard criteria for looking at the reliability, historically, of ancient documents, and that by all those criteria, the New Testament does wonderfully. But in the end, our final kind of trust is not in textual critics' methods of study. It's more in the witness of the church that gave us the Bible and the continuity of the church all this time. Thank you. So I just want to say that up front. I don't want it to sound like the fact that it's, as we'll see, more than 99% surety of reliability according to historical standards, that's what we base our faith on. What I want to do is to say it, first of all, because you'll someday get challenged on this. Well, isn't it just a bunch of hearsay, or how do we know it's 2,000 years old? These documents, how can we trust that this is reliable stuff? Maybe we don't really know anything about Jesus at all. And I want you to be able, in your own mind, to know why that's not the case. We really can. And second, for folks like the ones who've asked me the question, so that it doesn't become an obstacle to faith. Our faith ultimately doesn't rest in modern textual critics' notions of how historical documents should be judged. But if that's a concern for them, I want to help lay it to rest. We don't really need to worry that somehow all the evidence points to the documents in the New Testament as being unreliable, and that all we've got is a legend or a myth instead of a real man who is also the Son of God. So let's, if you'll take a look at your handout, it's a little more extensive than it was last week. Got some things going on there that, I'm going to use a few terms that, like textual criticism, things that get used. Don't let that get in the way. Reliability, however many syllable word that is, it's a big word, but I don't want you to feel like this is some kind of college lecture. What I want to do is say, these are the reasons why you don't have to worry about whether the New Testament is historically reliable, that the information we have, the truth, testimony, and testimony about Jesus, the witness to Jesus, not just from the church, but even from the documents themselves, are reliable. And that's something you don't have to worry about. So let's start out with the first section of it. What are the challenges to the historical reliability of the New Testament documents. And what do we mean by the historical reliability of New Testament, of any document? It refers to that document's trustworthiness as a witness. Trustworthiness as a witness to the events that it reports. So, New Testament documents primarily talk about Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection, those things. So can we have some sense of trust that they are reporting to us what really happened? So the second question that would be, why would the reliability of the New Testament documents be challenged in the first place? I can think of several. I'm sure there are plenty of others. But the first is that when you read the 4 gospel accounts, there are places where they're kind of in tension with each other, where it's not real obvious how you reconcile all the parts of them to each other. So one example I can think of is how 3 of the Gospels, the first 3, talk about the Last Supper being the Passover meal. John seems to talk about how the Passover hasn't happened yet because the Pharisees don't want to go into where the Roman pagans are because they'll be unclean for the Passover. So how do you get those kinds of things together? And those kinds of things, that's on the surface, there are tensions, but as you look at them, there are ways to reconcile those things. That, for starters, there were 2 different traditions going on in Israel at the time about exactly when you celebrated the Passover. And it apparently seems to be, with both of those accounts, that the Pharisees were doing it according to the Pharisaical tradition, and that Jesus and his disciples were doing it according to the other tradition that were going on. And that John's reporting one and the Synoptics were reporting the others. But, so that would be one reason why people would say, okay, gosh, I wonder these things, how do we harmonize these things? Second is that there are things in historical documents outside the Bible that don't seem to go along with the things that are in the Bible. And a lot of times, for me, it's a matter of, okay, do I trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, or do I trust this secular guy that I don't know anything about? His sources, his character, his reliability. So that one doesn't bother me too much. I know, for instance, I think of one example where this isn't so much text, but critics were challenging Luke on the fact that in the book of Acts, he uses a particular technical term to refer to the elders of the city, the rulers of the local city. I can't even remember which one it was, maybe Thessalonica. And so for a long time they were saying, tut, tut, tut. He's not even using the right term, he's wrong. And then finally, within my lifetime, the next archaeological dig in the ruins of that city, they uncover things and they find out, oh my goodness, here's a stone inscription, and it's using exactly the word that he did to apply to those city rulers. And they had to admit that their whole criticism of him had been based on the fact that there was nothing in the historical record that used that term for those elders and that he was getting it wrong, when actually he had it right and all the others, their silence meant nothing. Because now they finally found that, yes, there it is in stone, it was used. So I'm not quite as concerned about some of those things because other documents can get it wrong. The Gospels include another reason then why they would be challenged, and this is a reasonable one. The Gospels include accounts of events that are quite extraordinary. So men don't get up out of the grave every day, right? And so it's understandable that people would say, well, I don't know if that's true or not, because I've never seen that happen before. We all know that's not much of an argument. There are a whole lot of things I've never seen happen before that really do happen. And I think this is important, it was important for me going through both undergrad and grad school looking at the New Testament documents, that many contemporary challenges to the historical reliability of the New Testament, especially the Gospels, are driven not by scholarship, but by an anti-Christian animus, or by the denial of a supernatural reality. So I'll give you an example how it can drive things. In the Gospels, certain Gospels, there's a prediction, a prophecy of Jesus that Jerusalem will be surrounded by enemy armies and destroyed. If you don't believe in the supernatural in the first place, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe that prophecy can happen, that you don't believe supernatural things can happen, then that leaves you with a dilemma. How Was it just coincidence? How was this prophecy in this book that this was going to happen? And it did happen. So their obvious solution is, well, the book wasn't written until after it happened, and they're kind of writing back into the story, making this up to try to make it look like Jesus knew what he was talking about. You see how that works? It's you start with the assumption that there is no supernatural. You start with the assumption that prophecy can't be. I think about that, and I remember saying to one of my friends in class when my professor was saying that, well, we all know the prophecy can't take place, so the book had to happen after the event that it's supposedly prophesying. I said, well, that's interesting. In that case, the book of Revelation hasn't been written yet. So, anyway, I saw it again and again at Yale, my undergrad school. I remember my New Testament professor. We talked about it in this class before, during my atheist period, had some encounters with demonic powers that helped to change my whole notion of what the world really was, to help me see that my tiny little secular worldview did not fit the reality I was experiencing. And that's why I wrote the book about it, as a coincidence or something else. And so that had happened by the time I'm taking this New Testament course. I remember the professor getting to a place where it's talking about an exorcism of Jesus, and he kind of, well, we all know that this is legend because demons don't exist. And I remember, I wasn't going to interrupt the class, but I remember sitting back and saying, Bubba, you got to me too late. I've seen too much. You need to open up your worldview. Or the same with miracles. I mean, I'd seen people healed. I actually saw food multiplied one time. I could tell you about it some other time, but by the time I got to this class, I'd had this 2-year mission in Europe where remarkable things happened. And they would do the same thing. Well, we all know miracles don't happen, so this is legendary. I say, no. Your world is too small. Your universe is too small. There are things, like Shakespeare said, things that happen in this world that are beyond your philosophy or anything else that you've got there. So, the third point then would be, why is the historical reliability of the New Testament documents so important? There are some religions in which, if they had similar documents, they could say, it doesn't really matter if our founder really existed or not, because what's important are just the ideals that we teach. So Confucianism, for instance, if Confucius had never lived, it wouldn't really matter to the, or you could have if Plato had never really existed, but we had the teachings ascribed to Plato, it would be fine. It would be, his philosophical system stands on its own without having to have a particular man in a particular time and place who taught it. But the Christian faith is very different from that. Very different from that. Even though there are people who try to claim that the Christian faith is like that. They will say, oh, well, Jesus' message of, be kind to each other and loving, that's all that matters, really. It doesn't matter whether he rose from the dead or whether he died on the cross or even whether he even existed. And the answer is, yes, it matters. It matters completely. It is essential to the Christian faith. Why is it? Because the Christian gospel claims to be not just a philosophical or ethical system, but an historical revelation. It's something that happened in history on which our faith is based. Our faith is universal, yes, and it's eternal, yes. So it's not bound by time or space, but it is based on particular historical events that took place in Palestine when the Emperor Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire. Very particular that way, and there's some theologians that call it the scandal of particularity. It's big words, but what they mean is that it's most people want their religion to be just kind of a system of how to do good, when actually Christianity pushes against that and says, oh no, we're actually talking about Jesus, God became a particular man in a particular time and place in the history of the world. So think about the historical claim at the heart of the creeds. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. That's part of what we confess, what we profess as part of our faith, an essential summary of our faith there in both the creeds. Crucified under Pontius Pilate. He is a particular Roman governor in the land of Palestine in the first century. It wasn't just that he was crucified or that he was a nice guy or that he had good teachings. He is the Son of God, made flesh, crucified within a particular time and place. So maybe I'm repeating myself, but I think it bears repeating. It's such an important point. Our faith is an historical faith, as well as universal, as well as eternal. It has historical elements that either God came to earth as a man and did the things he did, lived and died and rose again and ascended to heaven on our behalf for our salvation, or, as St. Paul said, if that's not true, we are of all men most miserable, because our faith is empty. It's vain, he says. It's empty if Christ did not live and die and do these things, rise again for us. So how do historians judge these kinds of things? What are the standard criteria for a historian who's looking at any particular book? And you can follow along in your handout there, the outline. There are two types of judgments that are made. One is the reliability of the text itself. By this I mean, how certain can we be that the texts that we now have in our hands are reasonably accurate copies of the original. This is where we look at the telephone game thing, where people are saying, well, this got passed down for 2,000 years. How can it possibly be the same thing? The beginning, how can I trust that it is? And for this question, how reliable is the text itself? How close is it to what the original was? Has it been corrupted? Has it been added to, changed in significant ways? There are certain things that we look at to see. The first is the length of the time between the events that are reported and the writing of the report. Now we can all see, I think it's pretty obvious why that would be important. If something happens and it's 300 years before we have the writing of the report that is in our hands, a lot could go on during that time, right? But how about if it's only been a decade, 2 or 3 decades? How about if it's written in the lifetime of all the people who experienced it? Very different matter. Second, then, the number of existing manuscripts, copies of the manuscript that are subject to our examination. So how many copies do you have of a particular book? If, as we'll see in a minute, you've got some historical text from the same period or earlier, and we only have 3 copies existing, it's a little hard to kind of do a check on those to see how well they agree. If you only got 3 copies out of probably hundreds that originally existed. On the other hand, if you've got thousands of copies of this thing from different places around the world, different cultures, you can compare them and see how much have they changed, how close are they to each other. So very important aspect of it. Then the next would be what we call the textual down to us, claiming to be the Gospel of John, but it came by way of the Syriac translation of over in Syria, or the Coptic translation down in Egypt, or a Latin translation over in Rome, or something that's coming straight from Palestine. Do they all look alike, or do they have very different stories? You just say, gosh, that doesn't even look like the John I know at all. Next would be the length of time between the writing of the original text and the production of the earliest existing copies. So what do we mean by that? That it's important how old the copies we have in hand that we can check, how old those are. Do they go back close to the time of being written, or is it much later? So in this case, a couple centuries is pretty good, actually. And if you have fragments that go back sooner than that, that's really good. But in most ancient texts, we'll see it's much longer, hundreds and hundreds of years it can be before we actually have a text, and so we know it's already been copied many times before we even get this little fragment of it. So then next would be the number and the extent of citations by other ancient writers, and I should add in other translations as well. So do you get folks within 100 years, 200 years of the events and of the time when the things were written, do you get other writers quoting this person, saying, as the gospel says, or as John says, or as we know from the words of our Lord, and it's a quote from that text. So that tells you a lot too, because if those citations match up with the text, that's great evidence that it's a reliable text. So all those things have to do with the texts themselves. Are they reliable according to the standards of historical study? But then second would be, a second type of evidence would be the reliability of the sources themselves, of where the kind of internal the sources that the authors drew from, and also the kinds of way they wrote it. So what do I mean by that? First is the priority of eyewitness testimony. That's always really important. If you can get eyewitness testimony, of course, even in a court today, we know how important that can be rather than just the others. Doesn't mean you rule out everything else. But if there's eyewitness testimony and there's good evidence that there's eyewitness testimony that the text itself claims to be and actually gives indications that it is, that really raises up the level there of credibility. Then second, the way that the texts are written. Do the texts display the language of historical research, even though they're ancient texts and modern historical research wasn't done that way mostly back then, but do they seem to approach that direction? That they're looking at, they're saying things like, I wanted to know what really happened, so I went and interviewed all these people. And this is what I have been able to determine, as opposed to the language of myth and legend and a high and far off time. I think of what was Rudyard Kipling's Just So Stories. In the beginning of the story about how the elephant got his trunk, it's called The Elephant's Child. In the high and far off times, O best beloved, the elephant had no trunk. And then he goes on, and it's obviously kind of legendary, mythical story language, intended to be that way. Or you read the Greek myths, and you don't have dates put in there, you don't have references to particular political authorities that you can check against the historical record. It's a very different kind of language. Or you read the Paul Bunyan stories, and you know right away it's a legend. Not just because he does extraordinary things, but by the way the whole thing's told. So is it the language of something approaching at least or pointing toward what we would call historical research? Or is it the language of myth and legend? And then, how about the similarity of accounts in multiple texts? If you have different books and they claim that they are writing about the same event and they coincide, that's another important criterion there. And then the one I really love, it's called the criterion of embarrassment. The criterion of embarrassment. What we mean by that is there anything in the text that you would think the person producing the text would not really want to be in there because it would somehow embarrass his cause or his community? Because if something like that is in there, it's less likely, much less likely, that he has fabricated the story. So in other words, let's take an example. You're the early Christian community. If you're trying to claim that the Gospels were produced out of, are false, just fabricated, and that they're writing these books to try to convince people to become Christians. And so let's get them in. Are they really going to say that Peter, the prince of the apostles, denied Jesus? Are they really going to say, their first pope denied Jesus? Are they going to say their first pope that at one point Jesus said to him, Satan, get behind me? In that culture, the women's testimony wasn't accepted in court. So are they going to say that the first and primary witnesses to the resurrection of Christ were women? I mean, those would be embarrassing things within that culture. So things like that, it's very important, the so-called criterion of embarrassment. So let's go into the third part then. How reliable are the New Testament documents then, according to these criteria? So what I'd like to ask you to do is take a look in your handout there at the chart. The first chart here, too. What we've done here is, and this I did borrow this chart from online, though I could never find exactly what the original source was, which is why I can't post this. We've got a number of ancient writers, some of them from before the time of Christ, others from around the time of Christ, but all for that same ancient period. And you've got the name of the author, then you've got the approximate date when it was written, and then you've got what is the earliest copy that we have of that particular document or a portion of it. What's the approximate time span between the original and the copy that we have? How many copies do we have? Using the different things that they do to calculate this, what would they estimate as the accuracy of the copies that we have? So let's take a look. Okay, let's look at the reliability of the text itself, the things that have to do with that, with the New Testament. First of all, it was only a matter of decades between the writing of the documents and the events that they recorded. Best estimate is that Jesus died about the year, 2930. We often say 33 because we expect him to be born in 1 AD, right, or something, but actually it's probably more like 4 BC. Not because the church has it wrong, but that was one particular historian in the Middle Ages trying to figure out setting times. And most of the evidence we have is Jesus was probably born about 4 BC. Christ born 4 years before Christ. I know it sounds crazy. So anyway, about the year 2930 AD is when he would have been crucified and rose again from the dead. And most of what the Gospels are about, they have a little bit about his nativity, and of course just a tiny little bit about his childhood. Almost everything has to do with his last 3 years of his life, and then great proportion of it has to do with the last week of his life. So that's the time we're talking about. And the New Testament documents, at least the Gospels we're looking at, well, in fact, all of the New Testament. Most scholars agree the New Testaments were all written before the end of the first century or close to it. So perhaps the Gospel of John and Revelation seem to be like right around the end of the first century. But even then, it's only 70 years. In historical terms, that's nothing, 70 years after the first. But there are plenty of others that are much sooner, the Gospels. And the letters of Paul in the 60s. It's only 30 years after the events. The Gospels, 60s, 70s, maybe some as late as the 80s. Scholars debate this, and that gives you a good idea that you can't put all your faith in the scholars. But compare this now to the interval of centuries between most other documents and the events they report. So we have like our earliest copy of Pliny, the elder, who wrote in the first century about the same time. The year 850 is the oldest that we have. Others, Plato and others, that centuries go by between the earliest copies we have of anything that they've said. But it's not that way with the New Testament. Let's look at the number of existing New Testament documents, the manuscripts that can be compared. They are far greater than all the other secular stuff. So Lucretius has 2 copies, Pliny 7, Plato 7, Demosthenes 8, get all the others, Aristophanes 10, Caesar 10, Tacitus 20. With Sophocles, you get up to 193, and then Homer's is really an outlier on all this. The copies of the Iliad, about 643, but that's very, as you can see, very unusual. How many do we have in the New Testament? 5,600. Why? Because the book was so important to so many people, they hung on to their copies and they made more copies. 5,600 copies. So the number of New Testament documents that still exist, the manuscripts, that can be compared, it's like 5,686 are the ones in existence today. But in addition to that, we've got more than 19,000 copies in the Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and Aramaic languages, early ancient translations of them. So the total that we can compare with what we have as the originals, the total supporting New Testament manuscript base from ancient times is more than 24,000 texts. It's just far beyond any other ancient text we have. So why is the number of texts so important? We touched on that a while ago, but it allows us to compare them to see what differences there may be. And if there are differences, to see how substantial the differences are. If there are many ancient copies in existence from various parts of the world, and they are substantially in agreement, then that's strong evidence that the texts have not been corrupted. They've stayed the same. They all back to a single original. So as I noted, when they have 2 copies of a manuscript by Lucretius, if they read exactly the same, well, there's nothing spectacular about that. Could have had 2 guys sitting there writing next to each other and one guy copying the other guy's homework, I don't know. 2 copies that say the same, that's one thing. But if you have thousands of copies from all around the Mediterranean world and beyond, and the differences among them are almost all extremely minor, like misspelling or inversion of a phrase, like the kind of thing a scribe might do, that's some strong evidence that the texts have not been corrupted. They haven't been corrupted. They have a high degree, as textual critics would say, of tenacity. They hang on to what they are. So the more copies they are, the easier it is to make meaningful comparisons. Then the textual agreement for those existing copies of the New Testament, then, according to this criteria, it is extremely high. Almost all the variations are inconsequential. As I just said, they're errors in spelling or grammar. They are inverted phrases. Maybe in translation, the word's a little, not quite the one you would have wanted the translator to use, but it's understandable. And the thing about these is with this many copies, you can identify and correct those. So you've got 10,000 copies that all spell the word right, and then 5 copies that don't. Well, you just know it's a scribal error. Okay, it's not hard to identify what the real reading is. So we are able to have the true reading. So there are 2 major families, as they're called, of texts that we have that come down to us, and they are in agreement 98% of the time. 98%. 2/3 of the remaining 2% can be resolved by textual criticism. Folks who have done this as a living, professionally, all their lives, they're able to say, well, what's going on here is this, and this is this, so this is actually the right reading. And it's the one that you have in most of the text anyway. And of the very few remaining variations in the text, none of them have to do with imported beliefs of the Christian faith. So if there's something that is still kind of, okay, these scholars would say this seems to be the most original, the others say this seems to be the most original. If we were just basing our faith on that, and we're not, on the testimony of the church, is where we're primarily basing our faith, then it wouldn't really matter. Okay, how many times did the cock crow? There are people who can kind of try to harmonize 2 different gospel accounts about that. There seem to be different numbers on that in the different gospels. But even if you can't reconcile it, what difference does it make to our faith? We have all the rest of the important things that are all showing us very clearly these texts are right. So the length of time between the writing of the original text in the New Testament documents and the production of the earliest existing copies, as you can see on the chart, it's much earlier than it is for all the other ancient documents we have. If the time gap between the original text and the existing copy is large, it's more difficult to be confident about what the original said. If you have 1,000 years that go by between the time when we know the text was produced and the earliest copy we have, you can kind of wonder about that. But if there are many copies from a time relatively close to the original document, we can be more confident of the wording of the original document. So again, look at that in the New Testament. Original copy, less than 100 years and so. We even have a fragment of the Gospel of John that dates back to around 30 years from the original writing. So we've got a fragment that is basically 2,000 years old. It was written, if not in John's lifetime, very soon after. This is extremely close by historical standards to the original writing date. No other ancient text has any kind of fragment like that. Next then, the number and extent of citations of the New Testament documents and translations too by other ancient writers, some who are quite close in time to the original documents. It's greater for the New Testament than for any other documents of the ancient world. Early in the history of the church, many Greek documents, including the scriptures, were translated into Latin, and by the 3rd and 4th centuries, the New Testament was translated into Syriac and Coptic, Armenian, Gregorian, other tongues. These versions help us to know more about the original, and again, they all converge. They all converge. The variations are very minor. We have sources from outside the Bible. We have catechisms. We have quotes from the church fathers that quote the New Testament scriptures at length, and they're in agreement with what we have. One scholar has even said, and I don't think he was even a Christian, I may be wrong, but he said, if all other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were totally destroyed, the quotations of the church fathers would still be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. So you've got all these folks in the early years quoting the text, and we can compare their quotes to the text we have. Now sometimes they paraphrase, yes, but you never get anything that contradicts what's in the text. So that all has to do with the reliability of the texts themselves. How about the reliability of the sources? As we said before, it was only a matter of decades between the writing of the documents and the events they report. So if the gospel accounts were false or fabricated, there were other eyewitnesses still around, many of whom weren't Christians, didn't like the new sect as they thought of it. They could have challenged the accuracy. So Luke writes the things that he does, and it's very early on, or Matthew, Mark, you would have had people saying, I was there, that's not what he said, that didn't happen. You don't get that kind of challenge. You don't get it even to the most important things like the resurrection of Christ. You don't. And the people in writing it would have been much more circumspect in saying, okay, I know John, Johannes, or whatever his name would be, Yeshua, Levi down the street, was there when this happened. If I embroider a little bit, he's going to tell everybody he was there. So it would have been, kind of a guard even for the people writing if they were tempted to do that. The other important thing is that given this short interval of time, there was insufficient time for a legend to have developed. Legends don't start out, Elvis notwithstanding, legends don't get created within 10 or 20 years after that. Anyway, believable legends. Yeah, sure, there are plenty of people who say, oh yeah, I saw Elvis pumping gas down at the Stop and Go. Or other kinds of things, or Elvis is living somewhere in Latin America, or I don't know, But it takes time, if a legend is actually based on a historical figure, it takes time for a legend to develop. And in particular, a legend can't be successful until all the pieces of the original is recorded. For that there's not time for a legend to have developed before these things are written. The other thing we talked about is how the language of the documents themselves, how are they written? The accounts are not written like myth or legend in the faraway times, or once upon a time, or that kind of stuff. They're very grounded in historical events. Luke is the best of these, of course, and every biblical scholar agrees that he's the one who kind of most explicitly follows this historical model. Listen to his dedication to Theophilus at the beginning of Luke. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us, just as they were delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed. That you may know the truth of things which you have been informed. I think I mentioned this in an earlier class where a grad student at Yale was trying to say, oh yeah, this is all legendary stuff, and they didn't even know what it was like to write history. And I pulled up my Bible and said, look at this. Maybe he failed to do it, but that was certainly his, so that you can have some confidence of knowing what actually happened. That's not myth. That's not legend. Or other kinds of things we may have mentioned before. Texts claim to be based on substantial eyewitness reports, and they do in fact include the kind of seemingly insignificant details that eyewitnesses typically report. The people in court will often say that you're talking to someone who claims to be an eyewitness. They'll say something like, yeah, and there was this guy walking right down the street or whatever, and it'll be an insignificant detail. And that's often an indicator that you are talking to an eyewitness, because they don't have this carefully crafted narrative that they're feeding you in order to get you to believe something. They're just recalling as it comes. So you get that kind of thing, for instance, in John, who's an eyewitness to the events in his gospel, where Jesus has the woman who's accused of adultery brought before him. And I think we mentioned this maybe last week. What does he do? John tells us he stoops and he writes in the dust. Now, does that advance the story? Does that advance any kind of agenda that he might have had if he's constructing this thing, fabricating the events? No, it's the kind of thing that an eyewitness would have said. And yeah, then he did this. But then he stood back up and you go back with the story. Other kinds of things, the number of fish, 153, maybe it has symbolic significance, but the number of fish that the disciples caught on one occasion doesn't seem to have any numerical significance that we know for sure. Probably just the kind of detail that an eyewitness included. He saw them because the fishermen would always count their fish, and he'd say, oh, by the way, it was 153 fish. So some might counter, well, maybe they've just fabricated the whole thing. Maybe they're writing this book to try to advance this new community they've got, this new religion, and it's propaganda, basically. It's propaganda. But think about this. These witnesses that Luke interviewed and the others that they were writing or being interviewed for the writing, they were willing to suffer horrific tortures and death rather than deny what had happened. So, St. Thomas skinned alive. St. Peter crucified upside down, St. Andrew sideways, St. James beaten to death with a fuller's club, and on. Terrible, terrible torments. You just ask yourself, who would gladly die? And they did it voluntarily. They could have renounced their faith and been spared. Who would gladly die such a horrible death for something they knew to be a lie, to be a fabrication? No, I can't. I find out. I must mention that the first head of your church, the first vicar of Christ, was called Satan by Jesus himself and denied Jesus. Those kinds of things you won't have. So, using these standard criteria then, to sum up, for historical reliability that are applied to other ancient texts by secular historians, even people who have no faith at all. Our copies of the New Testament documents can be estimated to be more than what they would say is 99% pure, reflective of the original, and the text has not been corrupted by scribal errors or intentional revisions. For all these reasons, we have substantially superior confidence, I think, in the reliability of the documents, far more than any other ancient text. They show what, as I said, what scholars call remarkable quality of tenacity. Despite being copied over thousands of years, the variations are so small and so inconsequential. So the writers and editors and copyists who transmitted the sacred word clearly saw themselves not as innovators, not as fabricators, not as embroiderers, but as faithful transmitters of what they had received, that they were passing on. They dared not intentionally change these texts because, well, you have actually a passage in Revelation that warns people not to do that kind of thing. So, last statement. If the New Testament can't be trusted, neither can any other ancient historical document we've got. We couldn't even write an ancient history if we say that those standards aren't enough. But again, we don't put our trust in these standards. We're simply saying, hey, if that's a concern of yours, look at this. But in addition to the confidence we can have about the text and the original witnesses, is our confidence in the 2,000-year-old institution of the church, with an apostolic succession that it's unbroken through time. The church herself is the guarantor that she has transmitted faithfully across the centuries the true accounts of Jesus Christ given to us by the apostles and other eyewitnesses of his life in the earliest years of the church. The overwhelming persistence of the content of the original New Testament documents then kind of goes along with that, but in the end, it's our confidence that when God gave us the church and that these same documents that say, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, and that Jesus saying, I will lead you into all truth to the church, and giving guarantee of authority to Peter and the others. In the end, that's the more tangible thing that we have. The church is still here, and we've had those truths revealed, transmitted, and made sure for us. So, in the last few minutes we've got, oh gosh, only a few, I'm sorry. How about some questions? Yes?
Can you give me a little more information about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Where are they? You know, you've got all this.
Mm-hmm.
Where are they located and what do they comprise? Well,
Okay, and we actually talked about, I guess it was last week or 2 weeks ago, so I'm sorry you missed it, but just briefly, they are copies of Hebrew text of the Old Testament that were discovered around the 40s,
yeah.
and they go all the way back. They're over a 300-year period that they're written, but some of them before the time of Christ and some after the time of Christ. And so they're Old Testament documents. But their importance for us is that it helps us to see that we're only focusing on New Testament today because we talked about Old Testament last week. But even in the Old Testament, it is amazing how you have these copies of Hebrew text so old, and you read them and how close they are to what we have today. So that was a good thing. The other was that again kind of gave us insight into the time of Jesus. Some of them were contemporary to that. So yeah, we could talk more about it maybe later. But yeah, does that help?
Where are they located?
Oh, they're now being kept in a museum that's actually dedicated to the Dead Sea Scrolls in Jerusalem. But photocopies, or not photocopies, simulations of the, what's the word for it? Copies anyway, photographs of them have been distributed to scholars all over the world because they're still studying them to find out new things. There are lots of pieces there. Yeah. Yes, it.
Is one of the reasons that we have so many manuscripts of the New Testament because people use them in the liturgy? Is that one of the reasons for that?
See, I would think so. And just because they were so doggone important. Mm-hmm. I mean, there aren't that many people in the history of the world for whom Plato's writings meant life or death. Mm-hmm. You know, and their whole eternity kind of depended on what Plato had to say about something. But Jesus was a different matter. And so even people who weren't Christians wanted to preserve it because it was so interesting to, what was going on. So, but that's a good point. Because of the liturgy, you would need copies of this for every, what I've called it a parish hymn, but for every church. So I think but for one thing, once we get to the Middle Ages, then you have, well, even before that, in the ancient times, we have so much that we owe the monks for their faithful labors that we talked a little bit about last week. Wonderful.
So are these all things, are these fragments that people have found on your back?
Yeah, some of them are full. So let's see. Oh yeah, you're looking at the very last one. We didn't even talk about that one.
You put it down there.
Yeah, some of them are fragments. Some of them are full text. But in the end, even to have fragments is pretty amazing compared to other historical documents from the ancient world. So yeah, that last one. If you look all the way, this time spans between the oldest fragments and the events they report. So that first one that we were talking about is written about the year 96, just a few decades after the events that it records. Another piece there written in the 50s and 70s of Paul's letters. We have a fragment of those from only 150 years later. You don't get that with other ancient documents. Again, because people's eternity didn't depend on those other ancient documents. Here?
The important manuscript, what, the P52 and the P46, are these articles of it, or what is that?
Yeah, that's just kind of the way scholars refer to either a fragment or a papyrus. Papyrus is, a fragment can be just a little piece like that. Papyrus is actually something that would have been rolled up, but it still may not be the whole book. Yes?
These 5,600 how does that, obviously we have millions and millions of scripture, but what is that 5,600 refer to? Does that include Protestant translations and other things like that?
These are all from the ancient world. So in other words, we have 5,600 either manuscripts or from before the year 500, all the way back like that.
What's the percentage difference between, if you analyze the New Testament Protestant versus original?
Well, it wouldn't make any difference in that in the sense that the same, if we have a fragment of John, it's in both Bibles. So,
I guess I was wondering, when Luther made these changes, obviously they were significant culturally, but how much of the essential story was changed? I was curious what.
The Gospels he would have left pretty much intact. Yeah, it's the Old Testament that he wanted to go after. There were a few New Testament books he didn't like, and he put them at the end. So he didn't like
that's right.
James. He didn't like Revelation.
He removed them, but he didn't.
No, he wanted to, but it was a little harder to get away with that. Yeah. So I guess, gosh, it's probably. Did you have one more, Barb?
When it says New Testament copies, is that the whole New Testament, or that's just a
Okay, that's on which chart?
down here? And you have 5,600. Is that copies of the whole New
It's.
Testament?
I think it includes partial. I'd have to check it, but I think it includes partial. But it's still. The point is just to see how many there are compared to Plato or Aristotle or anybody else from the ancient world. All right, we probably need to go. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God bless you. See you next week.
We were in Dublin 2 weeks ago.
Dublin, Georgia?
Up on our
Ireland. Oh, right. That's right.
we went to Trinity College, saw the Brooklyn Hills. Holy moly.
I've heard.
It's astounding, the detail and the illumination of the manuscript.
Let me just turn this on.